Before I introduce this afternoon's speaker, how many of you were surprised by the subject matter of today's great decisions issue? That's exactly what I expected. Now, this is a topic that, like the problems it deals with, has really been in the shadows in terms of foreign policy and international affairs for a long, long time. And there really are only a handful of folks dealing with it. I know of one person, Dr. Phil Williams at University of Pittsburgh, for example, who's been writing on this for about 10 to 15 years. I was actually delighted when Donna Schlehick brought to my attention the fact that we've got someone at Wright State in the history department who has been working on this for some time. So it enabled us to put this issue on the agenda this year and to address it. But I have often said to my own students, when talking about non-state actors in the world, well, they think about the human rights groups and the environmental groups and so on, and I say, well, those folks are the good guys. There are an awful lot of bad ones out there, the bad guys, the terrorists, the drug traffickers, the human traffickers, and the money launderers, and so on. And so this is a day when we go to the dark side, as it were, not the dark side of the UD student neighborhoods, but the dark side of globalization, the dark side of global politics. And I am really delighted, because I had not met her before, that we have Dr. Catherine Meyer with us, excuse me. If you have your schedule, you have the bio, so I'm not going to waste your time and hers by going through it. But please join me in welcoming Dr. Catherine Myers.
Yes, actually, I wasn't brought up to do this kind of thing. I was brought up in a decent household. But one of my colleagues got me involved in drugs, and it's been downhill ever since. Actually, I'm a historian, and I'm a historian of China, Japan, and I write about the Second World War and leading into the Second World War. And you probably don't know this, but there's a lot of drugs involved in it. So I'm also, besides a historian, an active member of the American Society of Criminology, and there's a lot of different kinds of scholars that go there. It's international, in fact, but they always think of historians as being sort of quaint, local color or something of that sort, but I keep up the side. Okay, actually, I think I've got the wrong one up here, but I'll deal with it anyhow. The way I want to organize this, there's a lot of different ways that historians look at things. And as far as organized crime is concerned, we would look at things, first of all, as the causes. And in terms of criminology and drugs, instead of, let's say, using the word causes, they use the word etiology, meaning cause of disease. And this is a word I've looked up many times, especially when I have to spell it. But when historians talk about organized crime, they look at what is the cause of it. And several people will take different sides. I like to look at all of this. And one of them is that organized crime comes from residual feudalism or kinship patterns. And in other words, they're looking at the way that modernization occurred, especially in Europe, but other places as well. And how, where some places you might have a centralized state formed very quickly. On the edges of that, you will have leftover feudal communities that don't fit into the centralized state and that revert back to their kinship patterns for protection, especially if they think they're being abused by this incoming centralized state. And of course, Italy fits into that pattern very nicely because it was industrializing in the north and not in the south, and especially Sicily. And so there's lots of examples of people who use this to explain what is organized crime or where does it come from. And I'll use several examples of this. We also see other schools of thought that say, no, anthropology, forget about that. Organized crime is simply another business model. It's a way of organizing the delivery of goods that happen to be illegal but still desired. And so they'll look at organized crime the way you would analyze perhaps IBM or McDonald's or something of that sort. And especially looking at the relationship between the corporate headquarters, shall we say, the dons and the capos, and then the street dealers. As being, street dealers don't make as much as the dons. In fact, they might not make very much at all. But it's a way for somebody in the slums who might not make it into a corporation, a regular corporation, but some street kid can then get into a gang, start selling drugs, start off on the corner, and then work his way up in the organization if he's lucky, if he's got skill, and if he lives long enough. And so a lot of people look at organized crime from the way you would analyze a business. It just so happens this business, it has no recourse to the law if something goes wrong. The third is where I come in, actually, and look at organized crime as in its political and strategic ramifications. Dealing in drugs, well, I guess Afghanistan is a very good example. People have fighting on one side or the other, and they need money to buy the guns, buy the weapons, buy the information, and so selling heroin is one way to raise a lot of money very quickly. And if you're trying to have a surface legal idea and then some darker operations, then selling drugs is a way to bring money in and send it out without it hitting the legal books. And Japan did that during the Second World War very nicely. And then there's a new school of thought that looks at organized crime as something that's a cultural development on borders. That people who live on borders, one side or the other, that each one of these people living on each side of the border are going to develop relationships with the other side of the border, sometimes stronger than with the dominant culture. And wherever you see borders, you usually see people smuggling things one way or another. It's just that now with the drug wars in Mexico, it's just a little bit more to our knowledge. So I'll talk about all of these because for myself, I find all of them extremely useful. But of course, I've seen academics fight about this. And as a historian, we also like to see pivotal dates and pivotal events. And so for organized crime, the two sets of dates, the first transition is, of course, Prohibition, 1920s and 1933. And the second, I'll talk about the 1990s. And that's the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of the internet has really allowed international organized crime to really change in structure, as did Prohibition. Of course, we think of Prohibition as being a noble experiment, and we think of the internet as a good thing, and fall of the Soviet Union as a good thing, but it created all sorts of opportunities that people didn't foresee. So we start with this idea of residual feudalism, and people in the actual mafia coming from Sicily will tell you all sorts of origins of what the mafia is, and this idea of omerta, that at a time when Italy was split, that Sicily was sort of oppressed by the growing creation of the state of Italy, and so people had to fall back on kinship patterns, the Don who would protect them, and of course that led into organized crime. They will also tell you that the mafia, the word mafia goes back to like the 12th century and the Italian Vespers and things of that sort. But an Italian historian actually looked into it, and he found that the word mafia was first used in a play than a play that was sort of a patriotic play for people of Sicily. And it was I Mafiosa de Vicari, and it was about a kind of a bad guy, but a political bad guy who went into jail. And so it's sort of, the idea of residual feudalism is something that people in the Mafia will tell themselves and use to make bonds stronger. Joe Bonanno kind of has this thing about, he would not use the word mafia. He talked about my tradition and about how he was raised in his tradition in Sicily, and he brought it over to the United States, and he maintained that tradition in the United States. And I don't think in his entire autobiography ever uses the word mafia. If we look in America, the word mafia, of course, has become sort of the code word for organized crime. We now talk about Chinese mafia, Russian mafia, all sorts of mafia is used. But in America, there was really from New Orleans an incident in which some Italians in New Orleans, they were banded together because they felt they were oppressed, but they also had connections with corrupt police. That's part of the pattern, actually. And at one point, one of the policemen, not Italian, a policeman was shot and killed, and there was almost a riot against Italians. Italians who were rounded up regardless of evidence or anything else and brought in and tried, but then after they were tried, they were lynched. And that became such a national scandal that the word mafia came into the English language. But this was the early mafia. This was Italian gangs versus Irish gangs. And later on, these early Italian mafia people would be referred to by newer mafia types as mustache Petes. If I can continue, this is global and so am I. If I can continue on the theme of the mafia as a kind of leftover feudalism, and perhaps introduce you to one of my favorite gangsters, Sheng. And he is a gangster who operated in Shanghai in the 1920s, 1930s, and up until 1945. And he was sometimes called the Chinese Al Capone, but compared to Al Capone, Sheng was kind of a piker. Sheng was better than Al Capone because he lasted longer, he had political influence, and at the top of his influence, he was invited to be part of the anti-narcotics squad in nationalist China. This is all at the time that Al Capone was being sent to prison for tax evasion. But Sheng, I like to bring him up because he started out very poor, and in the 1920s and 30s, China was in a state of civil war. And you probably know it was basically the nationalists versus the communists, and then there were gangsters. And of course, opium and heroin were illegal in China, and even more so other places. But Sheng was very good at doing first labor racketeering. He got his gangs to kind of clean out the communists in Shanghai in 1925, so he got political favors for that. He was also involved, or his best friend was involved in gambling rackets, and of course in narcotics. That was what he specialized in, was narcotics. But as a gangster, and when he moved his way to the top of this green gang, it was called, and it was done in a very hierarchical and patriarchic way. The person comes in as a little brother, and then becomes an uncle, and then moves the way up to the top. And once he was at the top of his game and very wealthy, he was very good at doing what a lot of gangsters do, and that is becoming the benefactor of the poor, of the place where he came from especially. He would go in his limousine and pass out money to the poor and do those kinds of charity work. At the same time, I don't want to paint him as a nice guy. He wasn't. and he got a little bit of a better reputation during the Second World War because he and his gang fought against the Japanese during the Japanese occupation. But at the same time, he was in it for himself. So Sheng and the Green Gang, and he's in China, especially in Shanghai, at a time, of course, when the Chinese political system was in transition. Transition's a nice word for civil war. talking about the Japanese Yakuza, everyone loves them. And if we talk about residual feudalism, they're probably the best example because they claim to be the last living tradition of the samurai values, a samurai system that was Japan up to 1868. After Japan modernized, samurai went the way of, well, legally they were disbanded, but the Yakuza, the underworld, they keep themselves together. It's a way of bonding. You pledge allegiance to somebody who introduces you into the family, and they're organized by, I guess gumi could be translated as organization, but it's like a family. You're introduced into it. For the Chinese case, it's almost like a wedding ceremony. You're coming in and pledge loyalty to this group, and especially to the person who has inducted you in, who is then loyal to the next layer, and hopefully everybody kind of moves up together. And of course, I can't bring up the Yakuza without talking about the tattoos. It's supposed a very painful process, and it's supposed to be a full body tattoo, which marks them for life. I also found out from my readings that this tattooing your skin that much damages the skin, of course, which is an organ and helps with elimination of waste and all sorts of things. So they have a tendency to liver disease because it also drank. If we look at these residual ceremonies, of course, what we know about the Yakuza is if they do something wrong or don't live up to their promises, they're supposed to cut off a finger. And it's one of these old ways of showing shame and showing repentance. So if we talk about this residual feudalism, the Yakuza would say, yes, that's exactly what we are. We're the leftovers of this tradition. When you read into it a little bit more, we find out that Mafia and even triads in China and Yakuza, they aren't all as loyal as they claim to be. Sometimes they will talk, but at least there's that myth that kind of holds something together. And if I'm making the case for this, I would say an organization that's illegal has very few ways of enforcing its law. You can't turn it over to a court. So we use these old cultural, I guess bonding is a good word for it, and the other recourse, of course, is violence. And if we look at illicit enterprise, and I'm going to the next one, but I'm going to go backwards sometimes to this idea of cultural bonding. But illicit enterprise, really, we can talk about Prohibition, because this is a time when organized crime changed, and it changed perhaps in the way that we know about it. As soon as Prohibition, 1920, was passed, the Prohibition law, there were already Italian and Irish gangs in New York, and Jewish gangs. We don't think of Jews as being lawbreakers, but there were a lot of Jewish gangs. And these are the people who would refer to the older generation, which is perhaps closer to that kinship group bonding. They would refer to them as mustache Pete's, because as soon as Prohibition was passed, in places like Chicago, New York, but also places like Springfield, Ohio, people who drank wanted their booze, and suddenly it was illegal. And there was already some organized crime there, and they were the ones that could step in and start organizing to sell it underground, or sometimes not quite so underground, sell it to a market that was illegal but very, very willing. And suddenly the price of alcohol went up. And we also see something we'll see later with opium. As soon as it's illegal, people start drinking. Why pay a lot of money for wine when you can have a nice martini? You get more bang for the buck out of that martini. So we see the rise of the cocktail, the rise of the speakeasy, and legal they weren't, but this new kind of organized crime was going to bring together a wanted product, and with people who had corrupt connections to the law or to politicians, and could actually they made drinking very cool, because a lot of people who didn't drink before Prohibition, at least in New York City, would start going because it just seemed so cool to go to those nightclubs, dance a little bit, and have a drink. We also have our DEA, or not DEA agents, but I guess they're mentors. Actually, they were corrupt as hell. But they did like to post, especially in New York City. And at this point, we begin to see taking, people who can supply this liquor, who can get it across that barrier, from England or from Canada into the United States. And we begin to see people, actually, we might not think of it, Arthur Rothstein, it's not a name that kind of flows off our lips as one of the forerunners of modern organized crime, but he is considered the one who really put together this idea. And he was not only into providing alcohol for the masses. He didn't drink, actually, but he later got involved in narcotics as well, and he was very much a gambler. He was actually from a decent family, and a very religious family, but he wasn't, right from the get-go, he wasn't that kind of guy. He even stole his father's pocket watch and pawned it, and then gambled with the money, and then bought the watch back. And he wasn't exactly an upstanding young boy. He was, though, a very good gambler, and he was good with money. And he was the one who was able to really start organizing lots of groups who were selling booze and kind of bringing them together so that they could make deliveries and kind of send it all over New York City. Now he has a counterpart in Chicago, and that's John Torres. And John Torres was, of course, Italian, and he was doing exactly the same thing in Chicago. He was also a violent person, but 5 o'clock he would go home to his wife and his kids, and he was a very good family man for all of that. And so what we see is because of so much money, there were so many conflicts, and the conflicts became violent. And so, yes?
I was just going to say, on HBO.
Yes,
Series.
Broadway.
Yeah.
Boardwalk.
Boardwalk Empire. It starts on the day Prohibition went into effect. It's supposed to be the replacement series for Sopranos. And it tracks
Him.
personality. Yeah.
Yes.
All of them.
If you like baseball, you know this person too, because he's the one who fixed the Black Sox scandal. Yes, and of course, like most of these people, he died a violent death. But I think it was just because he was very good at collecting gambling debts, but he wasn't very fast about paying them out.
They died the same year where they maybe bumped off at the same time? I don't know.
Actually, John Torres didn't die that year, actually. He was shot, but he didn't die, and he sort of stepped down, and that's when he kind of ran it as sort of in the background. That's when Al Capone really kind of takes his place. So, I should really, this is rain date, please. Yes. The problem with organized crime is that they can't go to the law courts to settle disputes. So the obvious answer is violence. But there's kind of a contradiction here. People wanted their booze, and politicians wanted the kickback from the speakeasies. But as soon as you start getting bodies in the street, both in Chicago and in New York, then you're going to get calls for cleaning things up. And actually, this is what happened. Al Capone was too public and too open with his violence as well. And I have to put Elliot Ness there too, because Elliot Ness was also very public with his arrests, and probably not as central to cleaning up Al Capone as there are other people behind him, but both of these men knew how to use the press. And that was the downfall of Al Capone, because if he hasn't gotten on tax evasion, probably some of the other gangsters would have gotten, because they didn't like that flashy openness, because they're hidden, they're dark. And Al Capone is the name that we know. So these two are, I guess they're the Prohibition, at any rate. And I think the two that really need to be brought to the fore as creating, going from the violence and creating something that was workable as Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, and they work together. So again, anybody who's looking at kinship patterns is not finding it here. These are two guys who grew up together and liked each other, and they realized that as long as one gang was killing members of another gang, that they're going to bring the heat down on their organization. Whereas if they were very quietly offering these services, they might be illegal, but there are enough people who wanted booze, and then later they really made a lot of money with gambling, that they could put together something that later got called the Commission. And it was to bring all of organized crime groups together and talk about any problems they might have. And so Meyer Lansky, of course, is famous for his Miami and then later Havana nightclubs. Lucky Luciano is sort of famous for kind of setting up one of the New York Five families. And this is one of those. The other one is the St. Valentines Day Massacre. You might like your booze, but you don't want to wake up in the morning and see that in the newspaper. And you may not have heard of this war. And it was not in Italy. Casalmari is in Italy. It was between two Sicilian groups fighting off one another. And I should say one was Group A was killed off, Group B was killed off, and Lucky Luciano was behind both of those killings, and he was the one that won. So, yes, and whether it's Prohibition or later in the drug culture, we do see, if we look at these business models, and I mentioned it before, but there's a lot of studies of street-level dealers, or earlier of street-level speakeasies and things of that sort. And what we see is, well, here are groups of people outside, they're, of course, blacks, Hispanics, earlier it was Italians and Jews. If they're outside of the normal culture and there are structural or non-structural barriers to the breaking into a normal job, then one of the places to make a living is in this, some people call it the underground economy, or the alternative economy, or the hidden economy. So we see these street gangs, you can picture them as a threat and a nuisance and everything else, but if you're poor and in a neighborhood, a disadvantaged neighborhood, this is a way to make a living. And if you can survive the early, your first entry-level job after you kind of prove that you're going to be loyal is just selling off the street corner, and taking the chances. And you might not make that much money, but it is a living. And sometimes people say, look, I'm not earning a lot, but I'm earning more than if I worked at McDonald's and I'm home and I'm taking care of my family. And then most of these people don't move up, but the few that do really kind of start organizing and bringing things together, and it's a way for them to kind of have, should we say, an alternative route into success. And there are a lot of studies that look at street-level gang dealing in that using the economic model, and starting from Prohibition and going right up to the present. On the other hand, if you're an anthropologist, you can see all of the rituals, and they have them there giving some signs as ways of coming into the gang and ensuring loyalty and making what anthropologists like to call a fictive kinship group. So, as I said, I don't come down on either side of this. I think they both work. Yes, and this gentleman here looks kind of like a businessman, but you wouldn't think of him as being an international spy and a drug trafficker, but he's one of my favorites. And if we look at this drug trafficking or international organized crime, it doesn't necessarily have to be drugs, and in this case there was a lot more going on. He was one of the big players leading up to the Japanese invasion of China. And he's Japanese, and he was a Japanese espionage agent, and he was in this area, Manchuria, which is where, at the time, the Japanese began their formal invasion invasion of China in 1931. You may remember the puppet state Manchukuo, or you may have seen The Last Emperor. That's it. This is the place, a place where I go to often, oddly enough. And so he was part of the Japanese, I guess he was a civilian as part of the Japanese military espionage group. And he did a lot of things, but one thing he set up was a way of smuggling opium. It was growing very nicely in this area of Manchuria and under Japanese license, actually. Japanese had an opium monopoly, and at least they were claiming that they were trying to register Chinese addicts in their territory and break them of the habit. But what they were also doing when they were planning the invasion from Manchuria down into the north of China, an invasion that would turn into the Pacific War, the Second World War's Pacific theater, they were trying to weaken the Chinese hold on a very weak hold anyway. And opium was being used both places as a kind of currency. You know? I mean, it was a state of utter chaos in China anyway. And so he was doing several things. One of them was taking Japanese grown opium, smuggling across a very porous border, and taking it into North China, where there were Japanese chemists who would make it into, they called it morphine, but it was really almost pure heroin. And they were selling it in North China, and a lot Chinese records like to say, oh, they're trying to weaken us so they can win the war. Japanese records say something very different, that there was so much chaos in North China that opium became a currency. And what they were trying to do was to weaken the Chinese currency and cause inflation, because at the same time he was smuggling opium, he was also smuggling counterfeit money. And just to give you a little cultural congruence, I guess, the chemists in North China, the Japanese chemists in North China, did a very Japanese thing. They figured out ways to make a cheaper, better product and deliver it and sell it with a better marketing strategy. And Sakata and his group were feeding into that. Later on, his group would also be involved in, we would call it germ warfare, trying to take plague germs and put it on money and scatter the money so people would get sick. This was not a nice war. But he certainly doesn't look like James Bond or anything.
Was there any interrelation between this fellow and the previous guy?
The previous guy not, but they certainly had Chinese contacts. In fact, the previous guy, Du Yuesheng, he had a best friend, and they lived together in a mansion that had two wings to it. So one wing for me, one wing for you at Shanghai. And when the Japanese invaded, his best friend sided with the Japanese, and Du Yuesheng sided with the nationalist Chinese. So, I mean, it was a really kind of a complex war. And then, of course, Du Yuesheng and his friends figured out a way to assassinate his best friend. So, a lot of good stories in there. But I bring up Sakata and strategy because we have several, I guess, contemporary examples of the same kind of thing happening, especially that India, Pakistan, Afghanistan border area is so dangerous. And I guess we hear constantly about opium growing. Our allies grow it, the other side grows it, Taliban grows it, and all sorts of things. It's also, the problem is not just the Afghanistan border, but Pakistan itself and the India border as well. And perhaps you know A.Q. Khan, his best friend is Dawood Ibrahim. Maybe I have a picture of him not, but the two of them. Ibrahim is a gangster. He's from India, but now he's probably living in Dubai or somewhere. He's from India, Bombay or Mumbai if you want, and he as a gangster. He started out as a gangster and doing what gangsters do, smuggling goods into India. But later, as things became political, he is Muslim, and he was implicated in some of the bombings inside of Mumbai, after which he left. And also in Pakistan, there are questions about, does he use his ill-gotten gain, which is not just drugs, but other things as well, in order to fund, A.Q. Khan, who's the father of the Pakistan atomic bomb, that information gets sent to places we don't want it to be sent. So, as I said, it's really good for funding things you don't want on the books.
Was he linked to Khan's, Khan is the one who trafficked nuclear secrets
right.
from Pakistan to Libya and elsewhere.
Right, exactly.
Was he linked to that
Yes,
as
yes.
Okay.
They're underground.
well? Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Oh, there he is. Doesn't he look like a gangster, though? And as you came in, we talk about borders as cultures, and one of my Japanese policemen that I read about, he's a Manchukuo police officer, and he kept saying, we look at this border and we think it's a solid line, but it's really an optical illusion. Or some people will say it's a space, not a line. And as we have to think about Mexico, and we talk about this, and that's a place where people who do border theory or border culture theory really like to investigate, because as violent as it is, there are people that live on both sides of that border. And as part of that, of course, it's just goods trafficking or people trafficking, it's also narcotics trafficking, especially after the Miami route was closed down in the 90s. And so what we see is, I guess the most important of those is the Sinaloa group. And the Sinaloa group have people who are bringing drugs to the United States and across the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo. And also, we think of them as outlaws, but in a place where the central government is not very effective, these people can become heroes, just the way Du Yuesheng was a hero. And what we see is in Sinaloa, there are whole ballads, I guess, narco-corridos are those ballads. And they're kind of oompa-ish, but I gave you some of the translations there. These are songs celebrating these heroes and celebrating their bravery. And isn't it clever? They're doing this to the Yankees. And just celebrating, and all the villains in these songs are always, the Border Patrol. And the thing that I love the best is this fellow here. He's in Khan, his shrine. He's the patron saint of narco-traffickers. Jesus Malverde. I guess he's I don't know that he'd be recognized in this institution as a saint, but he's kind of one of those folk saints. And the people there will go to his shrine and ask for miracles. And I guess he was an earlier bandit who fought against the government, so was a hero before there were narco-traffickers, and then he died and the miracles were attributed to him. So I just have to, I've got a picture of him on my wall. And then, as you came in, you were listening to Los Tigres de Tijuana, Tigres de del Norte, and there's a whole style for those narco-corridos, the hats, the kind of band, the way they sing, the boots, and they become kind of cultural heroes, not by trafficking themselves, but by honoring people who traffic. And so from this, we do see a kind of culture emerging. It's not entirely pleasant, but there it is, filling in some spaces. I'm kind of going along, mixing both theory and time, so I hope it's not too sporadic, but there's so many bad guys in the world, so little time to cover them all. But and I know in your book, your readings, they recommended a book called Mafia, and and I would recommend it too. You used it for some of my students, and their reaction after reading it was, I'm never leaving the United States again. This is an example of the new transition, and the fall of the Soviet Union has opened up all kinds of opportunities, especially for the Russian Mafia, and also the rise of the internet. I like to say, somewhere in the world it's 10 o'clock at night. Do you know where your credit card is? and the Russian Mafia often are the ones that they tend to specialize more in arms trafficking, people trafficking, especially Shanghaiing women, and telling women in Eastern Europe, we're going to get you a good job in London as a waitress, and they get there and they find out their passport has been confiscated and they're working in a brothel. People trafficking in other ways as well, bringing people from Africa in, cigarette trafficking, but also in cybercrime. They're very good at it. And I'm saying Eastern Europe, but they also have a very strong, presence in New York, in Brighton Beach, that area as well. So, the Russian Mafia, a lot of these are people who were in the prison system in the Soviet Union, and not all of them were political prisoners, and the ones that weren't were really tough people, and when they got out they had this kind of organization from the prison. And this, I don't speak Russian, but Vori Exakone, I've seen it translated thieves in law, and I've also seen it translated as thieves with honor, and so both of those will work. And these people come out of the Soviet Union. These are the ones that become the godfathers who are taking over business and things of that sort. Plus, they've got the connections, sometimes old KBG connections, and just make people's lives miserable many places, but at the same time they're delivering goods that are wanted.
Aren't they considered one of the most violent of the groups?
Yeah. I don't, what happens, there seems to be kind of a flavor of the year. And I think right now, the one that gets the so-called honors for that are the Mexican border, because there's so much going on. But I wouldn't want to know any of these people. Let's put it this way. And I do. Every time I read about them, I pay things by check for about a month and a half. and the Japanese got me out of the habit years ago. So, yes, I think violent maybe not, because that sort of comes and goes. Because once they're violent, then they attract too much attention and get cracked down on. But they're dangerous, or they're skillful, or however you want to put it that way. And they also go in for tattoos. This is one of the ones, he's probably not so dangerous anymore because he's now under arrest. He was one example of the Russian Mafia of not drugs, he was into arms trafficking. And arms trafficking and drugs and AQ Khan, and you put all of those things together, yeah, dangerous begins to take on all kinds of different meanings. And at this point, drugs is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much else going on. So,
Is he the one that's being held in Bangkok?
yes, or was arrested in Bangkok. I don't know where he is right now.
I don't think he's been extradited to Russia.
I don't know which is worse, but I'm sure whatever they're doing to him, he deserved it. I guess this is the Golden Venture. You may remember that, but there's been so many other of these. But 1990s opening of Russia, opening of China too. This idea of moving people from one place to another, places where there are limits on how many people are allowed in. The Golden Venture is a good example of this, because just like there's Russian Mafia, there's also Chinese Mafia as well. They're called the triads formally, but Mafia does. The word is so universal. And this Golden Venture used the routes that were set up by drug traffickers what they're taking people who pay a lot of money to, they call them snakeheads. If they're on the Mexican border, they call them coyotes. But they specialize in getting people from point A to point C with a lot of B's in between. The Golden Venture was part of that. The people who were on this ship, they went from Fujian, I used to know it exactly, Fujian province on the coast of China to, I believe it was Thailand, and then they were moved in this Golden Venture. It was really a derelict kind of tub. Moved down to Africa, where they had to wait for a while for something to be processed, and then they were taken from Africa around the Horn and then across the Atlantic Ocean, where they almost made it, and then they were shipwrecked off of Far Rockaway. And that's when the Golden Venture became very public, because these people were drowning there, and it was, I guess, March or April. The water was still very, very cold. And so those who were left were kind of arrested, and for a while they were held in prisons, part of it out in Pennsylvania, out in Amish country, where a church group kind of adopted them and tried to get them asylum in this country, which worked for some of them, but the cases that were left over were quite extensive. Some of them were in legal limbo for a very long time. So people moving, this is just one example of something that international organized crime can do, moving not just drugs, but moving people who want to get out of Africa into Italy to get jobs, or out of East Europe into Western Europe to get jobs, hoping that it'll be decent jobs, but maybe not. And in this case, these people were supposed to be moved from Fujian province, that tends to be the province where people leave, and then moving into New York, where they were almost in debt bondage labor if they had been successful. They would still have to pay off the snakehead. And so they were kind of beholden to, I guess we could call them crew bosses inside of New York City, Chinese groups that would keep them safe, but also keep them under lock, sometimes literally under lock and key, until the money was paid off. And some of the conditions were quite horrible for them. You can get a Gucci bag, or you can go to Hong Kong and get a Gucci bag. Or you can go to New York City on the street and get a Gucci bag. And sometimes, or you want a Rolex watch. There are lots of places you can get a Rolex watch for not so much money. And probably what you're doing if you do that is actually supporting international organized crime, because the people who make it in sweatshops someplace where they might be making the legitimate ones too, and sometimes you really can't tell the difference except in the price. These kind of get places in Hong Kong where they'll take you and you can buy these. There's also medicines, prescription medicines that are kind of being ripped off and being sold, and you don't know if they're really being made up to snuff or not. So counterfeit and illegal goods are really kind of part of this whole picture of international organized crime. And a lot of people who wouldn't use illicit drugs, and who wouldn't use brothels where the women are being held, and who wouldn't do any of those things, probably wouldn't think twice about saying, oh, a Gucci bag and it's only $100 instead of thousands. But it's still kind of the same group of people, or the same dark community that's providing them. If we can go back, probably know that there's the Mafia, but in Italy, the Mafia is not quite so strong as perhaps the one in Naples, the Camorra, and there's the one over on the other side of Italy with the word that nobody including me can pronounce. And these are also organized crime groups. And the one in Naples is perhaps the strongest now. There's a book, and I think also a film now, called Gomorrah, that talks about this, about the group and how they've got a real stranglehold on the government and also the enterprises in Naples. And they came to the public's notice because they took over trash disposal, including toxic waste. I mean, disposing of toxic waste can be expensive, especially if it's medical waste, but it's also very dangerous. And what they did is say, oh, we'll take care of it, just pay a minimal fee. And so we get Naples that now is a trash heap, and part of that trash heap includes radioactive and toxic waste that's just been dumped in landfills. And that's not how it's supposed to be handled. So also rise of kind of related illnesses inside of that community. So Naples, Italy is one place where I really see international organized crime, and the Camorra is making connections with the Chinese, not just the Chinese mafia, but Chinese designers and illegal goods makers. You know, we'll make something very cheap here, but we can get the Chinese to do it even cheaper. So we see some Chinese showing up in Naples as well. It's kind of a really kind of a poster child for all of this. And there tend to be nowadays new gangs, and I group them under organized crime. I would include motorcycle gangs. I mean, there are some that are perfectly legitimate, but like the Hells Angels are notorious for moving drugs from Canada into the United States. There's the Big Circle gang, a Chinese street gang of younger boys, mostly who came from the Cultural Revolution, and they're pretty tough, but they don't have, I mean, the older Chinese mafia would say they don't understand the old traditions. I mean, these are just tough guys. And but they are also around in Canada. And then, of course, gangs that come out of Latin America and have ties both in Latin America and in the United States, especially in California. And these also, is MS-13 it's called, that would also be something where the older gangs would say they don't understand the traditions. They're just on the street, you know, doing violence. But of course, there they are. Perhaps also more motorcycle gangs. I hate to tar them all with the same brush, because there's some people that just get together and ride motorcycles, but if you're just in the United States, motorcycle gangs here in our own backyard and elsewhere are very much into the manufacture and distribution of methamphetamines. I call them organized crime too. I don't have a picture for them, but I thought I would end by just talking about the problems for policing, which you think you can imagine are huge. Even if you're just talking about one country, it's a huge problem for policing. But when you start going across borders, the problems of policing include police cultures and different legal systems and different definitions of law and different states of corruption. And I think my favorite example of the problems of policing is the goldfish case. And I love the goldfish case because when China opened up first, it opened up, I guess, to trade just a little bit. It had been very much closed. And even though there had been a huge amount of opium use in China before the Communist Revolution, one thing the Communists managed after 1949 was to get rid of the drug problem, at least for 30 years. Well, that's pretty good, I guess. But then when things opened up, heroin that was coming from the Golden Triangle down in Burma found that the Chinese right at the beginning were completely naive about drug trafficking, especially in the 1980s. And so they stopped sending heroin from Burma to the United States through Hong Kong, where the police were watching, and they went through Shanghai. And one very clever customs agent in Shanghai looked at this bunch of goldfish that were going to San Francisco, and he noticed a whole bunch of them were belly up. And so he took one out and cut one open, and it was loaded with heroin. It'll kill a goldfish. And so he contacted his authorities, and the Chinese contacted our authorities, and they made what's called a controlled delivery of these goldfish. And so they found in the United States the people who were selling this heroin. Well, then it came time to go to trial. because they got the guy from China, his name was Wong, they sent him over to the United States to testify in the case. And this guy was in trial waiting for the American trial to start, and somebody told him about anti-communist feeling and immunity from persecution and all of this kind of stuff, and he applied for political asylum. And then he got into the trial and he said, no, I didn't witness anything. I was tortured by the Chinese police. And that all of the above could be true. He could have been guilty and tortured by the Chinese police, but our prosecutors were really mad. And I got to see this guy say, well, the Chinese know how to deal with them. They shoot them in the head. But in the meantime, Mr. Wong brought a case, a lawsuit, Wong versus Reno. And as I know, he's still in the United States, having gotten immunity from this. So, I mean, that really shows you, even when both sides really want to bring a case, because they're both determined to shut down a drug, not just one person, but a whole pipeline, the different law cultures and the different law systems and the different assumptions that people meet. And it's sort of, I mean, that case was laughed out of court, I think. The goldfish case is kind of a marker for how really difficult it is, even with Interpol or something, how that's one thing we can't even deal with Mexico right